And these are short, sharp lunchtime sessions for CoRE members that happen every 2 months. And they're intended to be a little bit of a deeper dive into a range of topics. My name is Deb Harris, and I'm a regional consultant and youth lead at Women's Health Grampians. And I'm joined today by Melissa Morris, who is our senior regional consultant and workforce capacity building lead, and is based up in the Wimmera region. So for this session around Gender Equality 101, we're going to cover 4 key concepts, and we want to cover today gender equality. What does it mean? What is it? The difference between equality and equity, important action areas, and intersectionality, which we're going to just touch very briefly on today. If you have any questions, please pop them in chat. And like you already probably realised, this session is being recorded and will be available on the Women's Health Grampians YouTube channel over the next few days. So I think it's really important that we take the time to acknowledge that we are meeting on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands. In my case, I am on Wathaurong country, and Women's Health Grampians works over a wide range of areas, including Dja Dja Wurrung, Wotjobaluk, Jadwa, Jadbajali, Wagaya and Yubagayak countries. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and we celebrate that this is the oldest continuous living culture in the world. So, Mel, what is gender equality?
Thanks, Deb. So at the outset, on the screen, we have a definition of what we mean by gender equality. So this particular definition comes from the Gender Equality Act, the Victorian Gender Equality Act, and it means this definition says that gender equality means equal rights, responsibilities, opportunities, and outcomes between persons of different genders. So it applies to everyone. And, you know, we know that there is a range of legislation that means that we have equal opportunities and rights, you know, the Federal Sex Discrimination Act, the Equal Opportunity Act, and, you know, more recently in Victoria, we've got the Gender Equality Act in Victoria, which includes a duty to promote gender equality. In the work that we do, many people think that gender equality refers to equal opportunities of rights. Equal opportunities and rights, but less so equal outcomes. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges for us in working in gender equality is to switch to also and is to make sure we consider the outcomes. So this is really a key message for us today, is that focus on outcomes, and that when there are unequal outcomes, we need to take action. And that specifically has been highlighted in the Gender Equality Act in Victoria, where it recognises that gender inequality is compounded by other forms of disadvantage, that women have historically experienced discrimination and disadvantage based on sex and gender, and that special measures may be necessary to achieve gender equality. So this very much is, these principles inform today's session and the work that we do through CoRE. And, you know, importantly, it's also important to acknowledge that gender inequality is a condition that's been characterised by unequal value and power afforded to men, women and gender diverse people. So that's a definition of gender equality, real emphasis on outcomes. Another key consideration for us in our work is, is to be considering before we look at and before we consider outcomes, and following on from the last slide, it's essential that as we talk about gender equality and gender inequality, that we do so with the understanding that everyone's experiences are different and that people experience various kinds of discrimination based on their identities. For example, their age, their gender, their sexual identity, disability or ethnicity and culture, and that these discriminations can overlap and create different and compounded forms of inequality and therefore outcomes. So when we'll be talking about some of those outcomes and stats, and it's based on the data that we have available, but bear in mind the outcomes can often be significantly different and worse outcomes from people from, you know, say, for example, a migrant and refugee background or First Nations background. So a key outcome for us, a key of this 101 session, it's a key message is that we really need to focus on intersectionality, and that is defined as the complex, cumulative manner in which the effects of different forms of discrimination combine, overlap, or intersect. So when we're thinking about our work and about dressing, balance, and equality or inequality, we need to be consciously also addressing these additional barriers and the way our programs, policies, and services affect different groups of women.
That's exactly right, Mel. And for example, I'm a white, able-bodied, 50-something-year-old educated woman who is cisgender, but I would experience gender inequality. However, I would experience it very differently, for example, from someone who might be living with a disability or a single mum or an Indigenous woman or someone from a refugee background. So I need to, and all of us need to continually be aware of our privilege and to use our voices to elevate the voices and include the voices of other women.
Yeah. And
we are going to have another CoRE conversation in July, which will cover intersectionality in more detail in a half-hour session, but I'm sure we'll into it. So why do we need gender equality? Well, we know gender equality prevents gender-based violence. Gender inequality is the biggest driver and the social context in which gender-based violence occurs. Gender equality is good for our economy. We know, and the statistics tell us, that if we eliminated the gender employment gap, we would increase our gross domestic product by 11% just by doing that. With organisations that have over 30% of women in leadership or in their workforce, their actual profitability increases by 15%. And like we've said, family violence and gender-based violence costs our Victorian economy alone $3.4 billion a year, and it takes up 40% of police work. So again, eliminating gender inequality would obviously improve outcomes in terms of violence against women. We know that gender equality improves health and well-being for everybody, for men, for women, and for our gender diverse community and across the age range. And fundamentally, gender equality is a human right. And there are a number of treaties which Australia is a signatory for, including the United Nations. But every person should have the right to respect and dignity and to be able to live their life as their authentic self. So I'm just going to move this slide across, but it's not working. There it is. Where are we at with gender equality in 2023? I just want you all to pop in chat now. And where do you think, out of 143 countries, where do you think Australia rates in terms of gender equality in 2023? Have a guess and put what number where you think we rank. It might surprise you to know.
Oh, we've got 68, 61, 53, 100, 70, 40, 75, 100.
Okay. Wow.
42, 41.
Okay, well, I'm going to tell you the top 10 are actually Iceland, Finland, Norway. They're not terribly big surprises because the Nordic countries often do very well. New Zealand, Sweden, Rwanda, Nicaragua, Namibia, Ireland, and Germany are in the top 10. Australia is number 43. 43 out of 146 countries. And that some of those countries are quite surprising when you look down that list and further down beyond the top 10, that there are countries that we perhaps thought wouldn't be doing as well as they are, and certainly are doing better than Australia. So We've obviously got some work to do, but we are absolutely making progress and continue to make progress. So where are we at in 2023? Well, the federal government is currently developing a national gender equality strategy, and they look at a number of areas in terms of a snapshot of Australia and what gender equality looks like. So they look in terms of economic equality across things like the gender pay gap, which we absolutely know still exist. We look at career progression, and they look at things like women accumulating far less superannuation than men. They also look at the burden of care, which largely falls to women. They also look at healthcare outcomes, and we know that health is hugely influenced by gender inequality and conversely equality. At all stages of life, women are at greater risk than men. And so although we might live longer than men, we experience chronic health conditions at high rates and poorer mental health at high rates. And we also have very specific sexual and reproductive health needs that change over our lives. And again, these are influenced by gender inequality. And interestingly, and not surprisingly, those women from marginalised backgrounds will experience even more disadvantage when it comes to health. So if we look at some examples in healthcare, the evidence tells us that the systemic issues in healthcare affect not only healthcare delivery, but also research. And so women disproportionately experience delayed diagnosis. They'll experience over and under prescribing. They will be a failure to properly investigate symptoms. And a great example of this, and not such a great example, but an example, is symptoms of heart attack, for example, are less likely to be recognised in women and more likely to be tied to emotions than they are in men, and they're less likely then to receive appropriate and timely care. So it's just an example of how that might look. But we also need to acknowledge that those harmful gender norms and stereotypes, and Mel's going to touch a little bit more on this now, affect not only health for men and boys. For example, men are less likely to seek healthcare. We know that. I think all of us live with men that might do that. And men and boys are more likely to undertake risk-taking and harmful use of drugs and alcohol. But Mel, can you just touch a little bit more around gender stereotypes and how they're contributing to gender inequality?
Yeah, thanks, Deb. And I think with this current paper that's out, it's really interesting to note, you know, the paper highlights those different outcomes, but really, you know, it highlights that stereotypes are holding us back. So that's holding everyone back and preventing people from being their authentic self. So that national paper highlights that gendered stereotypes and norms are at the core of one of our key gender equality challenges. So that's something that we can all do individually, but then when we look at how that plays out, you know, it leads to occupational gender segregation. It's highlighted as a key contributing factor to the undervaluing of care work, which is a highly feminised industry. You know, we see, you know, the underrepresentation of women in science, technology and engineering and maths fields, and also in you know, manufacturing and trades. And Women's Health Champions is doing a lot of work in that space in Act On Site and See What You Can Be. And we also can see the underrepresentation of women in leadership and decision making. And Deb's already highlighted the link with gender-based violence. So there's a lot of sort of economic quantification coming out now as well around the sort of economic cost of stereotypes and those gender norms. And so one of the stats that's referenced in that paper is if Australia abandoned prescriptive gender norms that constrain men and women education and work choices, the Australian economy would grow by about 47 billion by 2040 and 163 billion by 2050. So for those that are more motivated by the economic benefits, there are some significant economic benefits. But even looking at some of the other stats that we regularly talk about, and I'll just go through these very quickly, you know, there is a gender pay gap. 13.3%. There is quite a significant superannuation gap, and that varies across the ages. So depending on your age will influence the gender pay, the superannuation gap. So that can be anywhere from 19 to sort of 42%. Sports coverage, sports is important, and generally around 10 to 12% of sports coverage is of women, women's sport, different and higher when there may be key events on, but on average quite unequal outcomes in terms of sports coverage. We've got mention there of the percentage of female CEOs that are women in the top 200 companies in Australia. I think it's about 7%. But we also know, and Deb has highlighted this already, that there are quite different mental health outcomes and rates of suicide experienced, for example, by men, higher rates of suicide by men. So gender inequality outcomes appear in different ways. Deb.
So we've talked a lot about data, but we've also got to talk a bit about attitudes, because we know that attitudes are what drives gender inequality, and conversely what will turn it around so that we can achieve gender equality. So every 4 years in Australia we have what's called NCAS, which is the National Community Attitude Survey. This has been running since 1995. It is the world's longest survey of its kind, and it covers a sample size of 15,000 people each time or more across the country for rural and urban areas from ages 15 and above. So it gives us a really good idea of how people are thinking in our country in relation to the attitudes towards violence against women, but also in relation to gender equality. So things are improving, I'm happy to say, but there's also some really concerning statistics, and still, as we all know, work to be done in this space. So when we're looking at some of the results from the latest survey, which has only just come out in the last few weeks, we know that community attitudes towards gender inequality are improving, but there are attitudes that persist in a sizable a number in the community. And for example, if we look at the slide we're actually looking at the moment, there is a disbelief that as to how that women are exaggerating how unequally they are treated in Australia. So 30% of people believe that women are exaggerating this, and I think most women will tell them that that's not the case. They are also, there is a significant number who believe, in fact 41% believe that women mistakenly interpret innocent remarks as sexist, that women prefer men to be in charge of relationships, so that's 19%, and that there's no harms in sexist jokes. And we know that it's those low-level behaviours that then go on to support the social context in which violence against women occurs. So while it would be great to think that we can control all of the different outcomes, one of the things we really need to control is the attitudes that support these outcomes, and make sure that they give our society the best chance of achieving gender equality. So Mel, we've talked a little bit about attitudes in Australia, but what about globally?
Yeah, there was a survey, Deb, that was done by the Global Institute of Women's Leadership by King's College, based in the UK, in 2023. And they highlighted that progress on gender equality remains at risk of stalling, and partly it's around our attitudes. So we really need to work on the sort of attitudes and views. So based on that survey, globally, they found 54% of people agree that things have gone far enough in their country when it comes to giving equal rights to women and men, is how the survey was worded. In Australia, when asked the same question, it was 43% of people believed that things have gone far enough when it comes to giving equal rights. But, we can't really think back to that definition that exists in terms of outcomes. That's another factor. So in our work in gender equality, I guess it's important to realise that whilst we have come a long way there are some entrenched attitudes and views that we need to address moving forward. So that's probably the key message there. It's ongoing work. I'm conscious of the time, Deb, and we're going to need to keep moving along.
Yeah, we are.
But I did just want to highlight, for those of you that are in the room from defined entities, you will have done a gender audit that collected data in relation to the status of gender equality in your own organisations, and that would have informed your gender equality action plan. And even in the public sector in Victoria, which is in many ways quite progressive, there are still some quite different outcomes that exist. And in the public sector, it's 66% of the workforce are females, but there is still a pay gap. There is still a difference in leadership, and there is still quite a difference in the patterns of work. The Gender Equality Act, this report found that there was gender balance across the sector in governing bodies in the Victorian Public Service, which is fantastic. But if we again take but the Commission also found that there was a real lack of intersectional data, and that was one of the key recommendations that came out on that. Just recently, Deb, the Diversity Council of Australia have put out a report which highlights that, Australia-wide, whilst 46% of board directors were women, only 5.7% of board directors were culturally diverse women. So, we need to be measuring outcomes as best we can so that we can continue that work towards gender equality.
And look, at a local level, it's just important to, sometimes people think that this is all big picture, but locally in the Grampians region, our rates of family violence per 100,000 are higher than the state average. So you can see on that slide that we have 1,619 as the state average per 100,000. 5 of our LGAs, which are there, Horsham, Northern Grampians, Ararat, Ballarat and Yarriambic, are in fact above the state average, with a number that are below also. And this has been the case for a number of years now. So it continues to be a very real symptom of gender inequality in our community. So we really want to talk about gender equality and how it benefits everybody. And I'm really aware of the fact that we've been talking very much in binary terms so far, and we are going to touch a little bit more on how this affects our gender diverse community as well. But first of all, I just want to touch really briefly, gender inequality is it's not ideal for not only women, but it's not ideal for men. So currently in Australia, as of 2019, the majority of deaths by suicide and deaths by road trauma were actually men, and 96% of workplace fatalities were men. So there is a program that some of you may have heard of called the Man Box, and this is run by Jesuit Social Services. And this was some research that was done back in 2019. And it looked at the idea that there is an idea of young men have an idea of what it is to be a real man. And these are very constraining and very rigid ideas. And this actually keeps them within a box, and hence the name Man Box. So those sort of characteristics that they talk about in terms of what it is to be in the man box are things like being physically attractive, acting tough, rigid gender roles, heterosexuality and homophobia were in there, being hypersexual, being aggressive and appearing in control, and being self-sufficient, all of which doesn't make for great outcomes in terms of mental and physical health for themselves or for those around them. So when they looked at, just really briefly, I know this is quite a busy slide, but for example, it is not only in the perpetration of violence against women that we see men in the man box doing more of that. We actually see it in terms of the perpetration of violence against other men as well. So the use of violence as a form of behaviour. We know that it affects drinking, so particularly binge drinking, and you can see that on the screen there, and feelings of feeling depressed and hopeless, or feelings of thinking about suicide were significantly higher in those men that were identified as being inside the man box rather than those that were outside the man box and able to express themselves in a more authentic way. So with that in mind, that I guess makes us sort of think more about our work at Women's Health Grampians and the fact that we really are have a focus on promoting positive forms of masculinity and supporting and supportive male peer relations. And this is an essential action area for us at Women's Health Grampians. And it's one of the many reasons why we have just recently appointed our first masculinities advisor in Luke Baker, who I'm sure you'll hear more of over coming months. And like I've said, we are talking in a very binary sense. So we need to talk about what this looks like for gender diverse and trans people in our community. And Mel, you can talk to that.
Thanks, Deb. So certainly gender inequality impacts and rigid gender norms impact the outcomes for trans and gender diverse people. So, you know, research has highlighted high levels of verbal and physical violence and a significant burden of sexual violence experienced by trans and gender diverse people, poorer mental health outcomes and high thoughts of suicidality, and higher rates of intimate partner violence than cisgender people. So, you know, some of the binary gender norms that exist in our society lead to, and those biases can lead to poorer outcomes. So we've so far highlighted, I guess, what we mean by gender inequality and the real need to focus on outcomes and continue our work in that space. So when we think of looking forward and some of the key concepts, probably one of the other key concepts for us to really highlight today is this notion of equity, equality and justice. You know, on this slide we see the reality of outcomes, and I think we've just talked about them enough. I think in the next column, you know, people often think that equality is about treating everybody the same. So, you know, in this slide, we see everybody is being given the same supports, and but we can continue to see, because of the reality, that there are different and unequal outcomes. The next part shows equity, where we are providing different resources and adopting different strategies to enable people to have the same outcomes. So, and on the right is justice, which is, I guess, if we don't have any of those systemic barriers, then we don't need to do those equity steps. So for me, I always think equality really is what we're aiming for, but equity is the process, the steps that we need to take in order to work towards gender equality. I think this next, and this is really a key concept for us to think about. Sometimes people think we're being discriminatory or things aren't fair when we're targeting programs, but it's in this context of why this work happens. I think Stella Young summed this up beautifully when she said that too often we fall into the trap of thinking equal means the same, and that we achieve equality by treating everyone identically. So, you know, that's a really key message for us today. And if you're not aware of who Stella Young is, please have a Google, and also because a statue has recently been launched in Stall.
So this is just a really quick, I guess, example of challenging stereotypes, and in terms of the things that we need to be doing going forward. We recently had a celebration of women in trades at Women's Health Grampians, and again, this looked at how do we move outside of those expected roles and stereotypical roles. So we know that Australians hold vastly different beliefs and ideas and expectations even around how men and women, and in fact everybody, should behave according to their gender. And these views, whether they're conscious or unconscious, actually result in people being constrained in their choices, and they have impact on not only how they perceive themselves, but also how others are perceived. And so in terms of for each of us to go away today, we need to constantly be challenging stereotypes and asking why are we thinking the way we're thinking, and why can someone not do something? Is it actually in fact about attitudes that are supporting this?
Perfect segue, Deb, into the next
segue. I know.
That was well done. You know, a key strategy, I guess, for us in gender equality is to be curious. You know, do things have to be done the way they always have? Because if we continue to do them the way that we always have, we will not see equal outcomes. You know, on the slide is a very, you know, it's a quick article. It shows JOCO caravans coming out of the pandemic, you know, huge backlog and demand for, you know, people to be caravanning around Australia. They came up with a different, whole new different shift, you know, a shift that enabled women who had childcare and responsibilities having to pick up kids after the school. They created a shift around school hours that enabled the workforce participation by those women, and it enabled them to then go and pick up their kids. So, you know, how does this, you know, we need to ask ourselves, how does this issue impact women, men and gender diverse people? What are the needs of women, men, gender diverse people and people from a range of different backgrounds? And do we think the same approach for everyone is actually going to achieve the same outcomes, or will it actually, you know, perhaps increase inequity? So, you know, we really need to become comfortable being curious, talk with staff around you know, what they need to make their job work. They're individual strategies, but I think organisationally, you know, there are strategies that are well known and systems and processes that we need to do to achieve our gender equality work. You know, do those workplace audits, collect intersectional data, develop plans. You know, if we develop a plan and are held to account, then we will progress our action. You know, apply intersectional gender lens to a gender impact assessment on policies, programs and services. You know, centre marginalised voices and the lived experience of women in the work that you do. You know, we can have the policies that enable and support greater participation in the workforce and safer participation in the workforce. So sexual harassment policies, family violence leave, etc. You know, and another key strategy and more is to have the conversations with staff around flexible work, parental leave and normalise it for staff. So there's some of the known strategies that we can use as organisations to work towards gender equality.
And Mel, not only just having the conversations, but making sure that the attitudes in the workplace support men and women taking those various forms of flexible work and leave as well, because we know sometimes it's offered, but is it really taken up by everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, we will be sending you all out a email with a list of resources that we've talked about today. So keep a lookout in your inbox. And I just want to quickly touch on some upcoming events at Women's Health Grampians. On the 22nd of May, we have our Changemakers Dinner, which is one of our leading change events we haven't been able to have for quite a while with COVID. This is being held up in Ararat. It's a 2-course dinner, and we would encourage you to hop online and get your tickets. The links for this will be included in the email that we sent out. But it has some great speakers, and it's a great opportunity to see people face to face and perhaps catch up with some like-minded people as well and be inspired. We also have our community of practice for CoRE, where we will be looking more deeply at the National Community Attitude Survey. Yes, we will be looking at some statistics, but we're also going to have some actual real experience from people on the ground who are actually talking about what this looks like, what the data looks like on the ground. And that will be held on the 6th of June. Again, the link will be in the information that we send out. And there will also be some information around our upcoming CoRE conversation being held in July and how you as individuals can become a CoRE friend. So please keep a lookout in your inbox. Thank you so much for coming today. We've finished a little bit late, but nevertheless, please continue to keep a lookout, and we look forward to seeing you at our next CoRE conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll stop recording, but happy to stay around and chat with anyone that is still online.